Welcome to the Medicine Path Podcast. I'm your host, Brian James. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Richard Miller, a clinical psychologist, author, researcher, yoga scholar, and spiritual teacher. For over 40 years, Richard Miller has devoted his life and work to integrating the non-dual wisdom teachings of yoga, Tantra, Advaita, Taoism, and Buddhism with Western psychology and neuroscience. Among his mentors were Jean Klein, T.K.V. Desikachar, and Stephen Chang. Richard is the co-founder of the International Association of Yoga Therapy and founding editor of the professional Journal of IAYT. Richard is also a founding member and past president of the Institute for Spirituality and Psychology. He's the author of Yoga Nidra, the Meditative Heart of Yoga, and the iRest program for Healing PTSD. In our conversation, we speak at length about his non-dual approach, the mentors that have inspired him, and how yoga and meditation can be used to heal trauma. This introduction is a difficult one for me because it's the first time that I've recorded without my little dog, Sweetie, snoozing away beside me. If you've listened to the other episodes, maybe you've heard me mention her or even heard her snoring or shuffling about in the background. And I mention this because Richard and I talk about her in the podcast, how she had battled cancer and Cushing's disease, and recently a complete loss of her eyesight. And we spoke about how I've always been inspired by her resiliency and her ability to adapt, especially to this most recent trauma. Well, after recording this podcast, her health declined rapidly, and we were faced with a very tough decision whether to put her through another surgery or to finally put her to rest. So it's with much sadness that I report that we decided to let her go yesterday. My wife was up with her all night long, comforting her as she shuddered with pain and discomfort, and I spent hours playing music and chanting for her, which has always helped her to enter a state of deep rest. I think the peaceful environment of our home and the great deal of love and affection we gave her helped to extend her life. But yesterday we knew in our hearts that it was finally time to let her go. As she slipped away peacefully in our arms, I became certain that what was happening was that her soul was simply being set free from her long-suffering body. And it's still heartbreaking because I love that little body, and I'll miss her funny little personality. She wasn't always the easiest dog to have around. She could be very demanding, and she had a habit of chewing up our favorite cushions and blankets, but she was the most affectionate dog I've ever met. When she wasn't getting into trouble, she could be found gently snoring away beside me as I practice yoga, play music, and record this podcast, or curled up on my wife's lap as she tried to do her yoga practice or work on the computer. She always needed to be close, and that physical intimacy was what really bonded us to her. Her little sounds, her breathing, and her little paws that always smelled a little bit like corn chips. In the short time since she's been gone, I've been reflecting on how I simultaneously miss her little body and big personality. Yet, I feel the love that I have for her remains completely present and undying, and I hope I never lose that. It's amazing to me how much this little being has taught me about patience, unconditional love, being of service to those you love, and ultimately letting them go. I'll miss you, little mamacita. Rest in peace.
All alone, all alone, all alone, Jai Sitaram. All alone, all alone, all alone, Jai Sitaram. Nobody home, nobody home. Nobody home, dear Sitaram. Nobody home, nobody home, nobody home, dear Sitaram. Only God, only God, only God, Sitaram. Only God, only God, only God, Sitaram, Sitaram, Sitaram.
So I'm here with Dr. Richard Miller. Thanks a lot for joining me today, Richard.
It's a pleasure being with you today, Brian.
Thanks. So I was hoping that we could start our conversation today with a short meditation, and I wonder if you could lead us into that.
Sure, I'd be delighted.
Thanks.
So, with your eyes open or closed, take a moment and let your senses open to the environment around you. Different sounds, light or color that's coming in through your eyes or eyelids. And the sensation that's present in the body. Just notice where attention is naturally drawn to different sensations on the surface or in the depths of the body. And have a moment of welcoming what's present. We're not trying to change or fix or alter anything. We're simply welcoming what's present to the senses. You might also note if there are different feelings or emotions that are calling attention to them. If there is a particular emotion, might you just sense how and where it's felt in the body? And peel off any labels or words that you associated with it, so you're just with the rawness of the feeling, the felt sense of what's present. At the same time, might you set the thinking mind free, noticing how thoughts are just produced spontaneously. In a manner of speaking, the thinking mind doesn't need a thinker. It's just spontaneously producing thoughts. The body's spontaneously producing sensations, feelings. So might you take a moment and let attention open, so you're as equally present to what is in front as to what is behind, equally present to what is to the left and to the right, below and above. Inside and outside. And let all of these different directions, front, back, left, right, below, above, inside, outside, let them all merge together. So attention then is present everywhere, nowhere specific. Welcoming the body as an undeniable presence. Where we might also sense how this body of presence is more like a field that extends out in all directions. Feeling ourselves as a witnessing presence to all that's coming and going. There might come a moment where we let go of all these comings and goings of perceptions and sensations and thoughts. and simply rest as openness. Openness that's open to its own where, in a manner of speaking, there's a sense of presence that is everywhere. And just take a moment and feel this sense of the personality, or the sense of I-ness that we take and associate as our sense of self. Can we set that free to be here too? So we find ourselves, in a way, something more than just this limited sense of self, a vast openness that we might say is a field of love that welcomes everything. And then take a moment, and as we transition back to our eyes open state of consciousness, to keep this sense of presence with us, in a way nourishing it into our eyes open state of consciousness, as we welcome back the different sensations of the body, the perceptions of the environment around us, sounds, color and form, as the eyes are open to the surroundings. But may we nourish this sense of underlying presence, you might say the presence of our own beingness, even as we come back into our daily life. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Richard.
You're welcome.
That was beautiful.
A delightful entryway into conversation.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was important because the foundation of the iRest protocol that you've developed out of your exploration of Yoga Nidra and meditation, see, the foundation of it is this sense of beingness as the inner resource. And I wonder if you could speak about why that's so important when we're looking to heal PTSD, the effects of trauma.
Mm-hmm. Not just for PTSD, but in general, as we move through life, life is constantly offering us challenging situations, whether it's a psychological issue like PTSD, or a physical illness, or some change in circumstance, a change in job, relationship, whatever. Resilience is a really important aspect with which we can meet any situation and find an adequate response. What I came to realize in working with thousands of people over the years is it's important to feel an inner foundation, what I call an inner resource. It's like an inner sanctuary or refuge, where when we turn into it, we can feel a sense of grounded peace or ease or well-being that is truly unshakable. And it's from that ground then that we meet every circumstance, where we can discover that no matter what's happening to us, no matter our circumstance, we have within us, we might say, perfect responsive actions. If we are able to get still enough, we can see that we have the resources to meet any moment in our life. This inner resource, which you called out as being, the ultimate inner resource to me is our felt sense of presence of being. And when we really spend time discovering it, nourishing it, we can experience a really deep, unshakable ground of inner well-being, again, with which we can meet every situation. So in the protocol of meditation I developed, iRest, the first foundational principle really is to discover this inner resource, bring it foreground so we can feel it, and then learn how to weave it into every experience, every thought, every emotion we have, every perception during our daily life. So we really do feel moment to moment anchored in a deep ground of safety, security, ease with which to meet each moment.
Hmm. So when someone has experienced an extreme trauma, they might find it actually quite overwhelming to tune into the sensations of their body. And so how do you guide someone like that into this deeper felt sense of awareness when it might not feel like a safe place for them?
It's true when we're undergoing something like post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder or some really deep challenging situation, we can be flooded with different sensations, emotions. So I think it's important to come in very slowly and gently. I call it titrating in a little bit at a time so we don't get overwhelmed by the sensations that might be present. But I start with easy relaxation techniques like asking a person to sense the sensations in their jaw or their forehead or shoulders, and learning the difference between tension and, we might say, release. I don't use the word relax. I more use the word bring your attention to different sensations that are present, and then relaxation may follow. But the main thing is that we come in slowly, incrementally, and build the skill. One of the ways we can access, though, an inner resource is we can use an image initially, where we ask a person to find a memory where there was a time when they felt secure or perhaps at ease, and where and how do they experience that memory in their body, that sense of security or safety or ease or peace. And then we build from it, accessing these deeper feeling qualities that the image engenders, and then slowly letting go of the image and really paying attention to the inner sensations. And I find for all the people I've worked with, while it does take a little bit of time to build this skill, when we do it slowly, step by step, they don't feel overwhelmed. And the inner resource actually offers ultimately a place of timeout. So when a person starts to feel overwhelmed, if they orient to this inner resource of well-being, it's like taking a moment in a refuge where they can take a time out from the circumstances, regroup, and then come back and work with the situation anew.
Wonderful. Before we started recording our conversation, I was telling you a little bit about one of our dogs who has recently lost her sight completely. It's been something that has been happening gradually, and just a few days ago, she's lost the use of both eyes. And it's been pretty amazing to watch how resilient and adaptable she is. Within the span of just a couple days, she's already feeling a lot more comfortable finding her way around the house. And before we started this call, I had her outside and she was clearly feeling more comfortable walking around outside and exploring. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering, why is it that animals and humans experience a traumatic event so differently?
I wonder, in fact, if they do, because our nervous systems are so very similar, depending on the trauma and how often it has been received. In other words, many people will experience a single episode of a trauma, which, if the system has resilience built into it, it can recover fairly quickly. But if it's one after another, then the system can lose its resilience. The same thing with an animal. My feeling is both animals and humans, our nervous systems are so close. One of the things, though, that I see in the animal kingdom that we've forgotten in human kingdom is animals are designed when they're under a stress, in a manner of speaking, to shake it off.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll see an animal that's been in a stressful response, shaking or going to sleep. Whereas humans, often because of our social networks, our peer-driven networks, or our work requirements, when we experience a trauma, we're almost, we think we have to go right back into life, right back into our daily routines, and we don't get the opportunity to really shake it off, or we don't get restful sleep. Because what research has shown is when we go into deep early sleep in the evening, when we're in what's called a non-REM state of sleep, our nervous system is actually rewiring and integrating and getting rid of the deficits that need to be culled out, and embedding deeper, more calming, resilient resources. And then when we go into REM sleep, when our eyes are moving and we're dreaming, there's a deeper consolidation of that. What I find, animals who've been under great stress, often they'll find a hiding place and they'll use it to rest or to sleep. We human beings are shortchanging ourselves, because often when we're under stress, we end up not getting sufficient sleep, and a sufficient environment allows us to work through the event. One of the things I can imagine, which would be very comforting to your animal, would be for you to sleep with it or hold it or sleep near it, so it feels that sense of loving presence of you as it's recovering and building its own resources to this new event that it's experiencing, this sense of blindness.
Yeah, we've been trying to keep her close and using our voices in a soothing way so she knows where we are. And I found also she loves to come into my yoga space. And when I'm singing or chanting or just deep breathing, she'll just come and lie as close to me as possible. It's really wonderful. I mean, it just shows that what we're projecting, our own inner state, is felt by these hypersensitive animals.
Well, there's, back to the inner resource, when we really recover it, what we find is a place within ourselves, as would an animal, where while the body and the mind need healing and need some kind of intervention like sleep or social kindness around us, or a moment where we step back from our normal activities so we can heal, the inner resource provides us with an understanding that even when the body and the mind have been injured or need healing, there's something basic about ourself that's okay. There's fundamentally an aspect of ourself that never needs healing, is always whole, and doesn't need fixing or changing. When I work with people, and part of the protocol I developed is to help people find this inner place where they feel this sense of wholeness. So healing proceeds from wholeness, not to get or recover wholeness. So it's a kind of a paradox. If we can feel a sense of loving kindness, we might say, or a neutral aspect within ourself that doesn't need healing, from there we can address the aspects that do need healing.
And in your experience, I know that you've done a lot of work in prisons with veterans. I'm wondering, is there anyone that you've come across who has never been able to find that inner resource?
No, but interestingly enough, years ago, in one of our initial research projects, we had a group, 18 of them, who were chemically dependent on some substance. And when we asked them to inquire, could they find within themselves an inner sanctuary or an inner resource where they felt safe, none of them could relate to the word safe, because they had come from abusive backgrounds, as from children, where they had been suffering from psychological or physical or some other abuse. What we asked them then is, what word works for you? And they said the word secure. We can find a place or an image that helps us feel secure. So we built off of that, helping them first to find a sense of security, then into a sense of kind of well-being, and then ultimately that they could feel safe with themselves, even though the environment around them might not be safe.
Mm.
And I found working with vets, very interesting paradoxical imagery that people would come up with to feel that sense of security. One veteran said, "I'm holding my weapon. It's locked, it's loaded. My finger's on the trigger and the safety's off." And I asked him, "Do you feel secure?" And he said, "Yes. It helps me access this place in me where I feel secure." The guy next to him, his image was he's lying in bed making love with his wife.
Mm.
And we asked him, "Does this help you feel secure?" And he said, "Absolutely." So very different images, but when we'd asked the two of them to describe the felt sense in their body, they describe it with the same words and the same terminology and the same felt sense. So we know that each of us accesses our inner resource with different images, but we'll all come to a basic ground of security, ease, peace, well-being, and ultimately we can say, "I feel safe with myself."
Mm. You spoke earlier about maybe one of the contributing factors to ongoing symptoms of PTSD is that inability to kind of normalize our experience, to come back to a baseline. And I can imagine that people growing up in an unstable, abusive household, people who are in prison, people who are on active duty in the military might never have that space to reset themselves. And this leads me to ask, if in your experience, do you think some people are more susceptible to long-term PTSD than others? Is there something that you found as a contributing factor to that?
We do know people who've experienced early lifetime trauma in one way or the other. It could be a situation where they feel deprived of resources like food or shelter, safety, where they may have been psychologically abused or physically abused, or there was just some sense of deprivation. The brain doesn't grow in the same way that it does with someone who is in an environment where they feel a sense of thriving, a loving kindness around them. So we know that different brains look different, who's been on long-term stress or trauma and one that isn't. That's the bad news. The good news is through the research we've been able to see through yoga, through meditation, and through other forms, we can actually grow those parts of the brain to help them come back towards a normalcy. So, for instance, people who have been under extraordinary circumstances, their amygdala, part of their limbic system that controls emotions, is actually enlarged. So they're often feeling held hostage by anger or sadness or grief or some other aspect of emotion. Their hippocampus has actually decreased in size, and the hippocampus enables us to move short-term memories into long-term memory. It helps us have perspective, and it also helps us see the consequences of our actions. So we'll often see, say, someone who's been under tremendous trauma. They may be driving their car faster than is good for them, or their motorcycle, or using substances. They're not able to see the consequences of their actions, and they're often holding amounts of anger or depression. They're being held hostage. Through meditation, through yoga, we actually see their amygdala begin to shrink, their hippocampus begin to expand. They regain a sense of consequence of actions, perspective. They're able to restore a sense of cognitive facility of memory and cognitive facilities of just day-to-day thinking. And they're no longer as held hostage by their emotions. So when an emotion does come, they're able to process it, act within it, not react, but responsively be with. So while, yes, people who are under early trauma or long-term stress or trauma, their brains do look different than what we would call a normal person. We can actually help facilitate their body back towards normalcy. Will their brains ever become what we might call more normal? That's to be seen. I just love the research that shows that with consistent, everyday, little and often interventions of meditation, yoga, and working with things like the inner resource, we can go a long way towards restoring a sense of resilience and health and well-being and find ourselves back on track.
I think that's one case where the scientific research actually aids in this work, because knowing that the brain can actually change its shape offers some hope that someone's not going to be this way forever, which is something I often hear. It's this deep fear that nothing's ever going to change. I'm going to be this way. And that just gives someone a real sense of hopelessness, which makes it hard to get out of. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just the nervous system we see is changing, but through, say, interventions that have to do with breathing, we can change the relationship of the pH of the blood. When someone's under long-term trauma, it's not just the nervous system, but every organ in the body has adapted to that stress response. So meditation, yoga, breathing, they all help the entire organism come back to a state of well-being. So kidneys, liver, pancreas, blood, lungs, heart. It's when we're working with a long-term stress response, to me, it's kind of tantamount to turning an ocean liner in a new direction. It takes time and consistent application, but slowly we can turn that ocean liner of the body in a new direction and restore really deep health. So it's accumulation of a number of exercises. That's why in iRest, we have both the inner resource, we work with intention, we work with the body, we work with the breath, emotions, thoughts, well-being, awareness. So it's a body of tools. Each is necessary for proper healing.
I'd like to talk a little bit about some of your more influential teachers that you've met that have helped you integrate all these different things together. And so in your bio, you talk about two important mentors to you, one being the Advaita Vedanta teacher, Jean Klein, and the yoga teacher and son of the famous yoga teacher, Krishnamacharya, T.K.V. Desikachar. Now, I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about how you met both of those teachers and what you got from your relationship to each of them.
Sure. I began studying yoga, introduced to it in 1970 when I first moved to San Francisco from the East Coast. And I was fortunate to, soon after I began learning yoga, to meet a woman who had become one of my early mentors. She was from the Far East, had been raised as a Buddhist, had been taught yoga as her mother, but had also been deeply influenced by the humanism of Eric Fromm and the existential phenomenology of R.D. Laing. So I had some early influences plus a Taoist master, excuse me, Stephen Chang from the Far East, from China, who was teaching me Taoist yoga. But as I deepened into my studies, I kept hearing the name of Desikachar. In 1979, a friend of mine, Rama Jyoti Vernon, asked if I would host one of Desikachar's senior English teachers, Ian Rawlinson, for a several-week seminar, which I did. I had a yoga school. So I invited Ian to, for 2 weeks, come in and teach the teachings of T.K.V. Desikachar. In that first lesson with Ian, it felt like a homecoming to me. And I subsequently handed Ian a letter, handwritten, that he was to deliver to Desikachar, because in December of that year, he was going back to India to be with Desikachar and study. He delivered it to him in December. I got a note back from Desikachar within like a week. And on January 1st, I landed in Madras to begin my studies with Desikachar, and it really did feel like a homecoming. I felt I was in the hands of someone who really had a deep understanding, both from his own experience and the teachings he was also receiving from his father, T. Krishnamacharya. So we began a tutelage, we might say, that encompassed all the aspects of yoga, from hatha yoga to pranayama breathing to meditation to study of the Upanishads, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, chanting. It was really an extraordinary in-depth study where I was with him one-to-one. I would meet with him in his home for an hour or two. Then I would go to his Mandiram, his school, study with him where he was teaching groups, and then come back and again have private tutelage with him. And I was fortunate enough to return to India a second time, but also to have access to him as he was starting to come to the United States, and one time in Europe where I was with him to continue deepening my studies. I have a fun little story, if you don't mind.
Oh,
when I first met him, he asked me what I was most interested in, and I said, meditation. And he takes my hand and he says, come with me. And he holds my hand and he brings me downstairs and he opens the door, and all of a sudden we're in his father's room. Now, his father at this time, I think, is in his late 80s, early 90s. He's a ferocious figure. He's, one of the greats of yoga. And I'm thinking, oh my God, we're going to get caught in his father's room. So he leads me over and opens this beautiful meditation chest, which is his father's altar, takes my finger and dunks it into a liquid and says, taste this, which I do. And he says, that's my daddy's hand-pressed sandalwood oil that he uses for meditation every morning. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, we're going to get caught with our fingers in the cookie jar. So then we came back upstairs and I began my studies with Desikachar. It was always something that stayed with me, because every morning in going to meet Desikachar, excuse me for a moment, every morning in studying with Desikachar, I would pass by Krishnamacharya, who was on a swing, and I would namaste and bow to him and then go in and do my studies with Desikachar. Over the years, I also heard of a man named Jean Klein. And Jean was giving a series of seminars here where I live, and I was asked and invited to attend. And in that first evening with Jean, it was like a second homecoming. And I was struck, because he taught us a little bit of his own form of yoga, that it seemed to me he had studied with Krishnamacharya. So I went up to him after the first break, and I said, do you know a man named T. Krishnamacharya? And he said, well, absolutely. I studied with him in the early 50s down in the southern part of India. So now here's a man who had integrated the teachings of Krishnamacharya, who ultimately was teaching his son, Desikachar, but he had also integrated the teachings of Advaita non-dualism and a particular quality of non-dual teachings that comes out of what we know as the Trika or the Shaiva school of non-dualism, which has influences both in the north and the south of India. Jean introduced me to very refined aspects of meditation and awakening to our essential nature. And it was very touching when I went back to meet with Desikachar, and I said, I've been introduced to this man, Jean Klein, who ended up studying with your dad. And he's teaching me very deep aspects of meditation. And I'll never forget these words. He said, I'm just beginning to dive into meditation myself. I highly recommend you study with this teacher, Jean Klein. So in that moment, I ended what I might call my formal studies with Desikachar with his gracious blessing, and began my formal studies with Jean Klein But I did stay in touch with Desikachar, and I would see him and often visit him when he would come here or when I was in India. So I feel like I have the blessings of these two streams, the stream that Desikachar comes out of and the stream of the non-dual teachings that Jean Klein passed on to me that can be traced all the way back to a man called Abhinavagupta and these deep teachings of non-dual meditation and awakening to our essential nature.
Before we move on, I just wonder, what do you think the significance of the sandalwood paste was? Like, what was the significance of it for you in that moment?
Several things. One, the intimacy with which Desikachar very quickly invited me into. And I found that was what was extraordinary about my relationship with Desikachar and Jean. They both invited me into a very intimate, heartfelt, warm relationship where, like Desikachar always called us his friends, not his students. And Jean always said, I have no students. So there was a moment of intimacy where I was invited to, come into his father's altar. Now, for an Indian, Hindu, Brahmin kind of priest that Krishnamacharya was, when we meditate, we want something that smells good. So we have incense, something that we might put on our skin like sandalwood oil that has a sense of feeling and glide to it. We would put flowers down, that's for the eyes, a piece of fruit for taste. All the senses are invited in, so there'd be a bell or a chant. So my sense is the sandalwood had several portals for Krishnamacharya. One, he spent the time to hand press it. That created an intimacy with the oil. Sandalwood oil, when it's put on the skin, has a lot of healing effects, but it also has an incredible smell, as we know when we burn sandalwood incense. So I would assume these were instruments or portals that Krishnamacharya used every day in his own meditation. And Desikachar, knowing of my interest, invited me into that intimacy of both his own understanding of his father's teachings, but also in a moment of introduce me, we might say, to his father through his father's hand-pressed sandalwood oil, which I got to taste. So maybe I was taking a taste of Krishnamacharya at that moment in a very intimate manner.
Well, it definitely feels like an initiation.
Yeah.
I mean, to take that in internally is not something that would normally be done. Like you said, he would use the sandalwood paste on his body. So there's something that doesn't get any more intimate than that. It's really
I don't think so.
Really beautiful.
Yeah. And it is interesting, when I left after 3 months in that first study with Desikachar, he was always gracious to give gifts, and he gave me a gift of sandalwood incense in my last meeting with him in that first initial time that I spent with him in Madras.
I'm sure that it's impossible for you to smell sandalwood now and not be taken right back to that moment.
It's true.
And so maybe there's something in that too, Desikachar knowing that this would forever connect you to that place and time.
It could be, and I know, I was just at a conference with some of his longtime senior students, and we were talking about our experiences. And in the conference, there were pictures of Desikachar everywhere, and I became very deeply moved when I would look at those pictures and look into his eyes, because whenever I'd be with him, it was a feeling of a very deep, heartfelt meeting. Not just studying yoga, but really one human being to another human being, and with an extraordinary mentor.
Yeah, that's something I was interested in asking you about. I know in my experience, I've had a couple pivotal teachers who have became kind of like second fathers to me, fathers that could initiate me into a spiritual life. And I wondered if Desikachar and Jean Klein filled that role for you in your own development as a man.
Interestingly, I would use the term brothers. I was fortunate. The first mentor I had, Laura, became like my second spiritual mother, really mentoring me. Then I met another man along the way who really was helping me integrate myself as a human being. He was a psychiatrist, and he became more like my second father, spiritual father. When I met Desikachar and Jean, it was like meeting brothers in arms. And the relationship that they offered to me was of that kind of nature. They weren't putting themselves above me, they weren't putting me below them. I felt like I was being met as an equal and being asked to be met and meet them as an equal.
Mm.
I'll remember my last meeting with Jean shortly before he passed. He was in a wheelchair now, and he had had a number of strokes. And we were in his garden, and we were gazing eye to eye for a long time in absolute silence, which was always his way. And I felt a deep meeting. And then I opened my mouth and I began to thank him for all that he had given me over the years of my studies with him. And I remember having the distinct feeling of Jean looking back at me saying, "What are you doing? What are you doing here?" Like I was breaking our non-separation with a moment of putting him over there as the teacher and me here as a student. And I could feel this immensity welling up from him towards me of saying, "Stop it.
Mm.
We're just two loving human beings here. I'm not special. You're not special. You know, it's the relationship that is special." And I went away from that meeting very deeply and profoundly moved from that last meeting with Jean, where forever he was always emphasizing there's no teacher, there's no student. If there's a teacher and a student, there's a moment of separation. Can we heal that separation and just be here as two human beings?
Mm. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about is the differing approaches, or what I perceive as somewhat different approaches between Desikachar and Jean Klein. So one of the things that I often hear from people who consider themselves non-dualists, if we want to say that,
Mm-hmm.
is a kind of resistance to something like a yoga practice or a transformative practice, because it's in a way a denial that you're already here and you're whole and perfect. And then Desikachar's approach seemed to be very much based on the idea that yoga can take us from where we are to where we want to get to.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering how you reconciled those two different approaches. Or, I mean, if Jean Klein was teaching yoga asana, maybe he doesn't actually ascribe to that non-practice approach of many non-dualists.
Well, if I look at encompass who these individuals were, Jean Klein was trained as a naturopath physician. He was a musicologist, a lover of art, but he knew the doorways for healing body and mind through the use of yoga, sound, different diets, and naturopathic interventions. So he knew that aspects of the body, the mind, the emotions often needed addressing and healing, fixing or changing. But he was deeply influenced by the tantric Shaiva Kashmir teachings, which really emphasize the wholeness of our being, that there is fundamentally this about ourself that doesn't need healing. And from that tantric view, everything is seen as an expression of this underlying mystery that has given birth to the entire cosmos. So, in the framework of non dualism that Jean taught out of, everything is welcomed as ourself: body, senses, mind, yoga, any intervention, food. Everything is seen as an expression of the divine. Nothing's left out. So, there's a welcoming of dualistic aspects of life.
Mm.
For Desikachar, interestingly, the first text that he asked me to work with him on was the Taittiriya Upanishad, which emphasizes non-dualism. and no separation. Even as we were learning, or I was learning tools of yoga therapy, because I was bringing case studies with him of how do I help this person who had sciatica or depression or a prolapsed uterus or some aspect that needed healing. So with Desikachar, while he was emphasizing a lot how to change the body, the mind through these yogic interventions, breathing, chanting, and other interventions, he was also sharing with me the non-dual teachings that we saw through these ancient texts like the Taittiriya Upanishad. Now, what I did feel with Desikachar, he was still, we might say, early in his own studies with his father. And as he said to me, I'm just opening to meditation. Now, he died when he was young, 80, or not 80, in his 78, I think he was. He would have been 80 this year, 2018. But it felt to me like he was growing in that understanding in the depths of meditation, because he was also teaching Krishnamurti, understanding the teachings of Krishnamurti, who I would also call as quite a refined non-dualist. Jean was very much of an enlightened sage. He had realized the fundamental truths and had incorporated into his life and his teachings. So I asked Jean, when I was with him, what for you was the difference between the teachings of T. Krishnamacharya that you received and the Kashmiri yogi you studied with? And he said, what I also myself intuited when I was with Desikachar, he said, standing in front of Krishnamacharya, and for me it was standing in front of Desikachar, he said it was like standing in front of a translucent pane of glass and there was just light flooding through. And that's what I felt with Desikachar. There was just this incredible light in the teachings. He said, Jean said, when I was with the Kashmiri yogi, there wasn't any pane of glass. There was just light. And I realized when I came to Jean, that's the feeling I had in my first meeting. There was no opacity. There was just light. And so it represented to me the sense with Desikachar, who was slowly growing into these non-dual teachings. There was still some opacity, but there was tremendous light in the intelligence of his teachings. With Jean, there was such clarity, no opacity at all, and the ability also to address the body and the mind that may have needed healing. But he passed on to me this tremendous awakening of the perfection of ourself in our wholeness and our relationship, our what I would say our interrelatedness with the entire universe. So with Jean, it was a final, in a way, homecoming to my place in the universe. With Desikachar, it felt like he brought me to the doorway of my total comfort. Jean, in a way, led me through that portal into a true homecoming of my essential nature and relatedness with everything in the universe, where I don't perceive separation. Even though, say, you and I right now are, you're over there, I'm over here, and we're in relationship, and it appears separate, I can feel the underlying essence out of which I would say we're both birthed, our ultimate home ground. And I feel that with whomever I meet, and whether it's a person, a tree, a rock, it's that underlying essence that Jean really helped me discover.
Yeah, the way you explain it makes sense to me, because such a big part of Desikachar's teaching was about relationship. And so it makes sense that there's still some opacity there, that there's still an active personality with all its idiosyncrasies, I'm sure. Uh, that
Yeah,
makes sense to
interesting
me.
you say that, because in my relationship with Jean, what he kept dismantling, I would say, was a relationship of separation. And he kept emphasizing that non-separateness, even though I might be sharing a meal with him or having a conversation with him. It was always that emphasis on the underlying non-separation, whereas with Desikachar, it was more about the relationship.
That's felt like a natural progression to me, that for myself, needing to go into a deep intimacy with the dualities of life, with the polarities. But then it's kind of like, you remember that Pink Floyd album cover with the prism?
Yes.
And it was like all of the spectrum of light going into this prism and coming out as like a single beam. And it feels kind of that way to me, that I have to go through this deep exploration of the polarities. But then on the other side of that is that feeling of complete dissolving of the personality and
It's a
everything. Yeah,
it's
all
a
the
beautiful
differentiators.
image. Yeah, it's a beautiful image because in that sense we're all colors, different colors of the rainbow. But when we go back to our source, it's a one quality that we find underneath all of us. And if we could see that in everybody we meet, it would bring an end to war.
Mm-hmm.
We'd realize our essential nature is the same. We might look different on the outside, but on the inside, we're all the same, one color.
And that was J. Krishnamurti's famous statement that any form of identification is a form of violence, because any division creates some kind of conflict, right?
There's a beautiful saying from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It says, wherever we perceive separation, there will be fear and anxiety.
Mm.
And I take it in an interesting way. For me, everything is a messenger that's helping us come back to our divinity or our essential nature. Whenever we separate and project that there is another over there who's separate from us, it will give rise to a little bit of anxiety or fear because, in that sense, we could be hurt or harmed by them. But I think also the message in the anxiety is look back where we're separating, heal the separation, and the anxiety and the fear will dissolve. But then from a non-dual perspective, we can celebrate that reunification, that oneness, we might say, but also celebrate the apparency of the separation that's involved when we have a relationship. So there's an honoring from this more tantric non-dual perspective of both the underlying essence and ourselves as, we might say, so-called or apparent expressions of that underlying essence. So I love this idea we can still have relationship and really enjoy it. I mean, I love my wife. I love my kids. I'm enjoying my conversation with you. And we can celebrate this that we all share in common.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that I love most about the tantric approach is this acceptance and enjoyment of all the diversity of life, and really only being able to do that when you've got that fundamental core of understanding that we are all of the same source. And then that really frees you up to enjoy everything and to remain equanimous in the midst of all the differences and diversity. Yeah.
Yeah, and it brings me back to your animal. I think we all have four fundamental needs besides food, shelter, safety, clothing. You know, I think we all have four fundamental basic needs to be seen, heard, connected with, and a sense of belonging. And my feeling is when we really deeply feel that, there's a healing that takes place. Like your animal wants to be seen, even though it might not be able to see. It wants to be heard, wants to be connected with, and belong. That sense of cuddling or love then that comes in that moment is a tremendous healing for the nervous system. I know each of us as human beings, we want to be heard and be seen and connected with, and a sense of belonging that will help us thrive into our lives. And when we really do feel deeply seen, heard, connected, it gives us that underlying sense that there's something else here we might call love that reigns supreme in relationship, that we might say is the ultimate healing force. That when a pill from the doctor is delivered to the patient, just as a pill, it's not as deeply healing as when it's delivered with a handful of love at the same time. And I wish we could find that in all of our relationships. So when we're in a moment of conflict or discomfort, that love is still there, holding it as a deep inner resource so that we can navigate through the situation. But I think these four fundamental needs I really felt in my relationships with Desikachar, with Jean, with my Taoist teacher, my initial mentor. They all gave me that sense of deeply feeling seen, heard, connected, and with a sense of belonging.
Yeah, I'd agree. It seems like, those things that we think of as the base of Maslow's pyramid, the food, shelter, clothing, those are what we need in order to survive. But what we need in order to thrive is everything else that you mentioned. And it reminds me of, as I've been exploring psychotherapy, something that I come up that comes up a lot is this idea that 90% of the healing happens because of the therapeutic relationship, not necessarily any of the interventions. And
It was long known that a patient just sitting in a therapist's office often will feel better because they know that they're about to have a relationship. So it is that expectation of the relationship, especially when we have it. It brings a nice warmth into our body and a sense of well-being that really does give us a sense of safety and security. And we know if I just bring my hand to my heart, immediately the feel-good hormones of serotonin and oxytocin are released. When we think of our healer, our psychotherapist, or I would hope when your dog thinks of you or when you think of your dog, it's a release of oxytocin and feel-good hormones. He's starting to circulate, have their own healing potential in our body.
Yeah, I think Desikachar was onto that. Yeah.
I deeply think he was, and I know Jean was.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, it's interesting because people I know that have gone to the Yoga Mandiram to have an assessment and to get some taste of the treatment there, they often come away with the exact same practice, a very simple asana and breathing practice. And I know Desikachar was asked about that, and he said, "Yeah, it's interesting, right?" And what he was
funny that you say that, because when I went back a second time to India, I went back in July because I figured it's 110 degrees and nobody else in their right mind would want to be there, which was true. So I got numerous private lessons with him every day, as well as working with him at the Mandiram. But he gave me full access to the Mandiram. So I went through over 5,000 of these case studies. And I came back to him after about a couple of weeks of doing this, and I said, it's interesting, Desikachar. It seems like all of your teachers are giving basically the same intervention to whomever is coming, whether they've got a prolapsed uterus, they've got depression, anxiety, or stress. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, isn't that interesting? And I think, as you're saying, he was on to it's the relationship that does the healing. And then that they were getting these people to do things that they ordinarily wouldn't have. And there were slight changes and adaptations in what they were being given, but they were basically being given very simple, straightforward regimens. But I deeply believe it was part of the relationship that was really the healing instrument.
And I think the things that are in a lot of those practices, very simple asanas, the coordination of breath with movement, the importance placed on inner awareness, being mindful of everything that you're doing. These are really the resources that I see come up in so many different like trauma interventions, whether it's Peter Levine's work, your work with iRest. It's all about becoming more intimate with our own felt sense, with the body, befriending the body again, and ultimately finding healing, which, of course, the root of healing is wholeness. And so the mind body coming back together in intimate relation once again. And so the vehicle for that can be very, very simple, right?
There is a lovely image that we as healers or as human beings, we're sacred mirrors. Our ability to be clean here allows a mirror that we are to reflect back to the person a clear image of themselves, I take it that everybody already has within him all that they need for their own healing. They just need to bring it out. And my job as a sacred mirror is to help reflect and help them bring that to the surface of their own consciousness. So I love this image that, in a manner of speaking, we're simply mirrors. Our job isn't to fix or change, but to listen deeply. And in that listening, we're able to help them recover what they need to do, how they need to be in order to proceed in their own healing. It's not to say we don't bring our own expertise of possible interventions. You know, when I first went to Desikachar, I had some very serious neck injuries. And he gave me a series of poses to do, which he said, I think these will be helpful. So over the course of a week, I did them, and I came back to him after a week and I said, Desikachar, I feel worse for what you've given me. And his response, I'll never forget. He said, isn't that fantastic? Now we know what doesn't work. And I realized, thinking back on it, it was because of the relationship and my trust with him, and that his desire was to work with me and to discover what was best for me. But that meant that we would come upon things that weren't best for me, which then we could see, try on, and eliminate, and finally come to what was the best. That he, in some manner, didn't know what was right for me. Mm-hmm. It was going to be in our working together that we were going to discover what was right for my healing, which we ultimately did, and all the pain and the injuries went away. So when I'm working with the person, I take that same attitude. Our job is to work together and discover what doesn't work and what does work, and come upon and strengthen these that do. But it is in the relationship and the trust, because all of us as therapists, whether we're yogi therapists or psychologists, we're always going to make errors here and there. Jean made certain errors. Desikachar made certain errors. But the trust that they engendered, I never felt that they were trying to seduce me into some kind of cult or form. They were really after me discovering my own firsthand understanding. And Jean would often come over to me when I was writing my notes when he was talking, and he'd look at my notes and he'd look at me in my eyes and he'd say, make it your own. And I felt that with Desikachar too. He said to me, I'm an Easterner, you're a Westerner. Only you know how to take these teachings back to the West. But I'm happy to work with you to discover what ways you can to make them fit into a Western understanding. And that's what I tried to do with the meditation protocol I developed, which was to really make them as tools with which, when I give them to a person, they're discovering themselves, their own understanding. I'm not trying to enculture them into some understanding. They're coming upon it themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really beautiful that you even felt comfortable in the very beginning coming to Desikachar and saying, look, I actually feel worse. This isn't working. I mean, that's wonderful, because if you didn't feel comfortable doing that, if he had presented himself as some kind of ultimate authority, then you would just follow the program and you would actually never be empowered.
Yeah, and for some reason I have that odd quirk in me. I'm never interested in ultimate authorities. So I have found my way to extraordinary teachers who didn't take themselves as authorities, although they knew that they were masters of what they were doing.
Mm. Yeah, quite skillful. But I think in that skillfulness also is acknowledging that each person is their own ultimate authority, and that their felt experience is the truth of
Yes.
what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. And I really appreciate, as someone who's studied a lot of the yoga scriptures and done a lot of practice, when I read your book on iRest, I can see what's underlying it all, but you have a way of presenting it that is totally accessible to, I think, everyday people. And that's not easy to do, because I know once you open up some of these areas, it can be like a total rabbit hole. And, you can get into all these different models of the human being and all that. But you deliver, I think, the medicine in a very clear and approachable way. So I commend you
I
on that.
appreciate that. That is my hope, because there can be complexity in the understanding, but we've got to get it across in a simple, easy to understand way that is in a way secular too. And years ago, I was delivering a retreat in a more fundamental Christian community. And at the end of the retreat, one woman came up to me who was a very fundamental Christian. She said, I found nothing to object in all that you said during the retreat. And I remember thinking, I just got the stamp of good housekeeping.
Yeah.
So that we are able, I've always told my students, what I'd like is I'm standing by the door at the end of a class, and everybody's filing out one by one, and there's a Muslim and a Jew and a Christian and an atheist and a Rosicrucian and a Sufi and one of everybody. And they're all whispering in my ear, thank you for making the practice just for me today.
Mm.
And how do we, as teachers of yoga or meditation or psychotherapy or healing, how do we deliver what we're doing in such a way that everybody feels it's just perfect for them, respecting their age, their culture, their philosophy, their religious or spiritual background. So they really do take it in as simpatico or easy to digest from their own perspective.
Mm. Well, I really appreciate that. And this feels like a good place to end our conversation. So if people want to find out more about your trainings and your books, what's the best place they can do that?
My nonprofit, the iRest Institute, is at iRest.org, or they can simply Google Richard Miller and iRest or meditation, and they'll come to me. And I have on the website the different retreats and trainings that I teach worldwide, and my senior trainers and teachers teach worldwide.
Great. Well, I hope to make it to one of your trainings and meet you in person someday.
I look forward to it myself.
Great.
Wonderful being here with you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your time. I do appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for listening to my conversation with Richard Miller. If you value these kind of conversations and would like to show your support, there are a few ways that you can help. The simplest is to subscribe and leave a positive review on iTunes, which will help other people find the podcast. You could also share it with people in your social network. And another way is to become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/Brian James Teaching. Membership starts at just $5 a month, and supporters gain access to dozens of yoga practice resources that I've been developing over the past few years.